It was May 1st of 2011. May 1st, 2011. I was sitting in my dorm in the seminary, and I remember, towards the end of my first year of seminary, and just one thing about the seminary that's like a little bit of a quirk. Most seminaries, we didn't have a TV in our room. So if you wanted to watch TV, a football game or a show or something, you had to go in we had a handful of places like living rooms in the dorms, and you kind of like shared a common TV. My room happened to be like right next to the hallway to get into the TV room. So I would sit in my room and like study or read or whatever, and a lot of times I had my door open. So I was sitting in my room, and all of a sudden I see a handful of guys like walking and turning and like going towards the living room. And I just didn't think anything of it. I was like, maybe to go and watch a game or something like that, whatever. And then a little while later, I saw another group of guys go and do the same. And then another group of guys do the same. And after I noticed a few people go, somebody stopped in my room and said, hey, there's something going on in the family room. It was like the living room. I was like, oh, okay. Like he said, come check it out. So I'm thinking like it's gonna be like my birthday is like on May 9th. So I'm like, surprise party, maybe. Hey, like, we're gonna have something fun. Cake, right? Yeah, sure. I'm there, right? So we walk in though, and I'm either expecting like a big surprise, nothing. I'm expecting like something, but like a bunch of guys were huddled around the TV, and it was the news. And I'm like, we don't watch the news very often. Like at this time in my life, I was like, I didn't care, CNN, Fox News, any of it. I was like, whatever. But when we walked in, it was on the news, and it said the little thing at the bottom of the TV said, basically it was like president to address the nation. And I remember we all like walk in, and we like are curious about it, and we're wondering what's going on, and everybody's kind of buzzing, and people are like on social media and on Twitter and stuff, and this is before it was X, and like looking and trying to figure out like what is it, what's going on, and all this stuff. And all of a sudden, a card was handed to the anchor on TV, and they said the president's going to address the nation at whatever time, like in a few minutes, shortly. And they said Osama bin Laden has been killed. May 1st, 2011. I remember we were sitting there, and the announcement came across, and the guys in the room, there was just a bunch of different kind of reactions and conversations that people kind of went on. We saw the reactions on television, right? Some of the guys in the room, they were actually they were not only were they seminarians, but they were also like military or former military. So they their families had served and had been in Afghanistan and had been in the war on terror and all these kind of things. So there was like, that you could almost hear in their voice like a sense of relief or a sense of retribution. Some of us, like, you could hear like some conversations about like there's the question of like his soul and like what does that mean? And there was a bunch of different questions that were going on. Now, nothing I'm about to say, I just want to be very clear, undercuts the horrible and evil things that had been done, right? But I remember that it was a spark of kind of conversation that went on. And as we sat there and kind of watched the drama play out of the night, we watched President Obama address the nation, and then we watched like all the talking heads on every show wanted to talk about it and wanted to share their 2 cents. And then we saw the celebrating in the streets that was going on in some cities and some places. I remember like sitting there and just feeling like there's something almost disordered. There's something off a little bit about this. Because we're celebrating the death of a person. Now, again, I don't want to undercut the things, and we can have that conversation another time. But there was something about it where people watching this, like, I remember like just kind of stopping, and me and one guy were like having a conversation, and we were just kind of looking at this and seeing this play out on TV. And I remember we kind of sat there, and one of the things we said is like, this is vengeance that's played out. And don't get me wrong, like I could see where I had one of my buddies, right? His brother had served and had died in Afghanistan. Like, I understood where he was coming from, and like it felt like it was like for something now and all this kind of stuff. But like in watching this play out and watching this, like the drama of the night kind of play out, I remember sitting there and I was just very, very struck by the vitriol and the revenge and the vengeance that was kind of there, and like some justified and some like I could understand. But there was something about it that was just like, it was almost off-putting. It was unsettling, I should say, right? The interesting thing is on May 1st, 2011, on the other side of the world, there was something else that happened that same day. And this is why I can remember that date so clearly and so closely. It was actually the same day that on the other side of the world, Pope Benedict had celebrated a Mass, and in the Mass had beatified John Paul II. So John Paul II, that we now say is Pope Saint John Paul II, right? Well, before you become a saint, you become a blessed, which means there's one miracle attested to you. There's one miracle that has been proven and said, like, it's because of his intercession that this happened. And it's basically the first step on the way to sainthood. And I remember, like, somebody pointing this out, that it's interesting that on one side of the world, you see this kind of, this celebration of sorts that's going on. But on the other side of the world, this man, John Paul II, was being recognized and beatified. The reason why it was so interesting is, if you don't know, John Paul II survived an assassination attempt. That John Paul II was traveling through St. Peter's Square, and a military marksman, because they didn't like the fact that he was trying to take down communism, right? Basically pulled a gun on him, shot him, and missed by a quarter of an inch his widowmaker, and he was able to survive barely. But one of the interesting things about John Paul II is that after he was healed, after he was like brought back to health, after he was able to kind of to heal from his injuries, he made a point to go visit the man that shot him in prison. And in that conversation, he forgave him. A man who was coming after his own life. And he was able to say, "No, I forgive you." It's interesting that May 1st, 2011, these two events juxtaposed next to each other. And I think for us as Christians, we see what sometimes is the easy way to react. Again, I want to reverence the sacrifice of our armed forces. I want to reverence the atrocities of what went on, right? 9/11 and beyond. But you can see it juxtaposed. Sometimes what's the easier way, letting the emotion just pour out, and the harder way of forgiveness. I say this because today we come across, without a doubt, the hardest teaching that Jesus gives. I believe, no matter, like, out of everything else that he teaches and that he preaches, that today, in my estimation, I might be wrong. If you can find a better one, great. But in my estimation, I think that today's gospel is the hardest teaching for us to put into action. Because what it does is it shows that the existence in the life of a Christian is a very, very high bar that's hard to live. I think if I've seen these kind of things on social media where fundamentalists or some groups will go out and they'll ask questions to people kind of on the street, and they'll catch them off guard with different things. And one of the questions that I've heard asked is like, do you think you're going to heaven? So like, if I would be to propose, like if you would be walking into church tonight and I would have stopped you at the door and looked at you and said, do you think you're going to heaven? I got a feeling, first of all, you'd have been caught off guard. You'd been like, first of all, Father, why are you back here? You're supposed to be getting ready, right? Like, you're hearing confessions. But like, after you would have got over that, you'd have probably sat there, and usually there's two answers that come up. Do you think you're going to heaven? And you would have said yes, and then from there I would have said why, and then there's usually two reasons why people say, I think I'm going to heaven. The first one is, well, I haven't killed anybody. Great, like, that's good. None of us are murderers, I hope, right? If you are, I will report you. It's okay, right? So that's the first one. The second one oftentimes is, and I'm a nice person. Okay, so not being a jerk and not being a murderer. Cool. Okay, so that's typically what ends up happening as kind of the two reasons, or the two kind of justifications of why I think I'm going to heaven. There are plenty of others that people say, but oftentimes those are the two that we kind of go to. And that's a popular kind of mentality or a popular kind of mindset. So if that's what Christianity is, if getting into heaven is simply not killing anybody and being nice, that is a very, very low bar. That is an extremely low bar of living as a Christian. And that extreme low bar is contrary to what Jesus says today. Because Jesus doesn't say avoid your enemies. Jesus doesn't say talk about your enemies behind their back. Jesus doesn't say punch your enemies back, right? Jesus doesn't say be as strong as your enemies, right? Jesus doesn't say embarrass your enemies. He doesn't say gossip about your enemies. He doesn't say criticize your enemies. He says very, very clearly and very, very plainly, love your enemies. That is hard. Like, by definition, my enemy is somebody that I don't like. My enemy is somebody that I'm divided from. My enemy is somebody that I don't respect. My enemy is somebody that is other than me, right? So my enemy is against me, is antagonistic towards me, whatever word you want to use. But by virtue of the name enemy, by virtue of the word enemy, that means I have to go beyond myself and go higher to love that person. And to be completely frank, that's freaking hard. The easy thing is to criticize. The easy thing is to be nice and then jab them in the back or gossip about them. The easy thing is to wait for them to leave your house or to wait for them to leave work or wait for them to leave the room and then roll your eyes to the person next to you and be like, oh, may or may not have done that. I'm working with you right there, right? Like, it's okay. But how do we're called to love our enemies. Today, our first reading actually is a really good example from Scripture of watching somebody love their enemy and showing mercy towards their enemy. You see, Saul and David in the Old Testament from the prophet Samuel, like from the books of the prophet Samuel, there's this like interplay between Saul and David. We're not talking Saul that turns into Paul. That's a different guy later on in the Bible, right? We're talking about King Saul who was anointed king of Israel, right? The Israelites say, we want a king, and Saul is anointed king. When Saul is anointed king, he now is in charge, right? So Saul is the one that is in charge, and Saul is in charge whenever there's this giant named Goliath that's coming in. So a little background to today's first reading. Goliath comes out and says, I'm going to fight anybody, right? He's a Philistine. They're against the Israelites. He says, I'm going to fight anybody. You bring your best warrior. We don't have to shed a bunch of blood. We're just going to have one-on-one, mano-a-mano, winner take all, right? We win the battlefield. And he challenges him outright. Now, this guy's supposed to be 8 foot tall and all the best warrior that the Philistines had and all this kind of stuff. Great. So what happens is that the Israelites are huddled together and they're looking for somebody to send. And they think it's going to be Saul because Saul's the king and he's supposed to fight these kind of things. He's supposed to be the leader, but he's a coward. So Saul steps back, and what happens? This little shepherd boy named David comes forward. And when this little shepherd boy named David comes forward, they look at him and he's like, I'll do it. And they look at him and say, no, kid, like, you're too small, that doesn't work. And he says, no, I want to. And they say, fine, it's a suicide mission, good luck. And they hand him all of Saul's armor. And when he puts on Saul's armor, it's too big for him, it's too clunky, and he's kind of like just waddling around. And he looks at him and he says, kid, I don't think you can handle this. And David says, leave me the armor, I don't need it. Just give me a slingshot and watch what I do, right? Watch the Lord work with me, right? I'm paraphrasing. It's kind of like how, but you get what I mean. All right, so David goes out, really good shot, hits Goliath, knocks out the giant. The giant's dead on the ground, goes over, cuts his head off, and holds it up and looks at the Philistines and says, I win, right? Okay, great. David and Goliath, according to Father JD, you're welcome, right? At the end of this, what happens is that the people start to fall in love with David, and they see his courage, and they see that God must be on him, which he is, right? And it goes all the way back to when he was a kid. And he looks at him and says, God must be upon this man, right? So what happens is the people he becomes more popular in the people's eyes than Saul is, who's the king. And Saul is jealous about this. They actually sing a song, and they're like, Saul has killed thousands, but David has killed tens of thousands. And Saul doesn't like that. So what Saul does is he starts to chase after. He basically wants to kill David to get rid of him so that he could still have all the spotlight on him. And that's where we come in today. That we hear that Saul is pursuing David. And when he's pursuing David with 3,000 men trying to kill him. Now, I've been a pain in the butt a long time to a lot of people in my life, right? Just talk to my family. They will tell you. I've never had 3,000 people chasing after me trying to kill me. Right? But whenever this is going on, David, as he's running, right, like Saul's troops, they stop and they camp, and they all fall asleep. David and his aide Abijah are walking through the camp, and they come across Saul sleeping on the ground. Abijah, his aide, looks at him and says, like, the Lord has blessed you. He's even delivered your biggest enemy to you. All you have to do, like, Saul's sleeping, and it says in Scripture that his spear is right by his head. He basically took his spear, jabbed it in the ground, and fell asleep. And Abijah looks at him and says, all you have to do is take the spear, move it over a foot, and drop it. He's gone. He's not chasing you. It's over. But David recognizes who Saul is, recognizes Saul's authority, recognizes that he is the anointed one of God. He is the king of Israel, and I will not harm the one of Israel. No matter how much he comes after me. He might be wrong, but I won't be wrong too. So he says no. I don't know about you, but if that's going on, 3,000 people chasing me, oops, right? And let's move on. But David shows us an example of what it means to be merciful as your heavenly Father is merciful. David shows us an example of what it means to recognize the anointed one of God, like to recognize the dignity of the person that's in front of me and to say, no, I will not stoop to their level. That I'm going to forgive. I'm going to choose to be merciful. What he actually does is he takes the spear and he brings it back to camp with him and he shows it as a testament. I am merciful and you are not. Not in a gloating way, but in a way of saying, Saul, I could have killed you, but I will not do that. I say all this, and I think Scripture suggests all this because for Jesus, what he is doing is he's trying to call us to something higher. And quite honestly, whenever it comes to our faith, or it comes to forgiveness, it's hard. The reality is that the deeper the hurt that we have, whether it be with a person or a situation, the deeper the hurt, the harder it is to forgive, right? The deeper the hurt, if somebody cuts me off in traffic, I might blow the horn, I might tell them they're number one in a special way, right? But then like it moves on and it's done. And by the time I get to the next red light, I forgot that it happened. But when it's serious stuff, when it's family stuff, when it's pain, the deeper the hurt, the longer it takes to forgive. A lot of us think that forgiveness is a moment. Forgiveness is not a moment for most of us. I'm just letting you know. Forgiveness is a process. And we have to come to grips with it. And we have to continue to choose to forgive over and over and over most of the time. But the reality is that you and I are called to forgive the same way that Jesus does. And it might take time to get there. But we're still called to do it. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be getting into Lent, right? And when we get into Lent, there's the way of the cross, and there's the sorrowful mysteries, and there's the passion, and I think Chosen is getting to that point in it, where we start looking and reflecting more on Jesus' paschal mystery. And we look at his passion, and we look at his death, right? In Jesus' death, he went through torture. He went through hell on earth in carrying his cross to Calvary. And when he got to Calvary, what they did was they beat him the whole way there. They put 6-inch nails in his hands and in his feet, and then they put him up for everybody to mock him on a cross. Crucifixion was 3 hours of suffocating. And when he goes through all of this, what happens at the end is he looks up to heaven as people are still mocking him. And he says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. We are called as Christians to do our best to forgive like him. And man, it's hard. The interesting thing is that every time we come to Mass, we agree to this wager. Whether you realize it or not, during the course of the Mass, every one of us agree to this wager. Because we want to be forgiven as well, right? We want to be forgiven by God. Because quite honestly, God, I mess up every day. I say dumb things every day, like sometimes in this homily, like I have multiple times now. I do and say things all the time. I act in certain ways that I need your forgiveness, Lord. I need your forgiveness more than anybody else. Like I'm a sinner, like St. Paul says, I'm first, right, of all of them, right? Like we are all sinners, and we know this, and we need God's mercy. This is one of the things that we say, though, in seeking God's mercy. Very popular prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. You all know it. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Hear this. We could speed through this line, but think long and hard of what we're saying here. And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Forgive us our trespasses. Forgive us the way in which we've messed up, God, the way that we've offended you, God, as we forgive those who have hurt us. The measure with which you measure will be measured out to you as we forgive those who will forgive us, who have offended us, who have trespassed against us, who have hurt us. We're called to forgive as Jesus does. We're called to forgive those around us the same way that Jesus does. And the reality is, it's hard. But to be honest, Christianity is a high bar. And sometimes we need the example of somebody like a holy saint or an Old Testament saint like David to show us what is possible. Being a saint is much, much more than just not killing somebody or being a nice person. If we're called to be like Christ, if we're called to reflect Christ, may we forgive like Christ. And if we can't bring ourselves to do it yet, that we would at least decide that we want to. That we would pray to God saying, God, give me the grace, give me the desire to forgive as you have forgiven me. I've said this before, but holding a grudge, being vengeful, it's like drinking poison expecting the other person to die. May we experience the freedom of forgiveness, the freedom of God's mercy, not just for our sake, but also as we receive it from our Father as well.